"Pick that up, sweetheart," or is bending over beneath a nurse's dignity. That is what Dr. Marcus Whitfield said 47 minutes before the news cameras arrived at Cedar Creek Medical in Atlanta. That is what he said while colleagues pretended not to hear. That is what he said to the woman whose hands had held 17 soldiers' lives together in Baghdad, whose call signs were whispered in JSOC debriefs, whose presence in his hospital was supposed to remain invisible until the fraud investigation concluded. But at 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning, none of that mattered yet. The fluorescent lights of the cardiac unit hummed their monotonous frequency, and Danielle Ross moved through the whitewashed corridors like a woman who had learned to make herself smaller than she was. She adjusted the 4-line on bed 4 with precision that made unnecessary movements obsolete. Her fingers, scarred across the knuckles, calloused along the palms from years of carrying weight that wasn't supposed to be hers to carry, positioned the catheter hub at exactly the angle that would minimize occlusion risk. The resident who'd placed the line stood watching from the doorway, already nervous about his own work. He shouldn't have been. But he was. Most people were, around her, without understanding why. Danielle didn't meet his eyes. She signed off on the line in the chart, her signature deliberately small, deliberately unremarkable. A nurse's signature. Just a nurse. That was the mission brief in 17 words: embed as nursing staff, document the billing discrepancies, and remain operationally invisible until the Inspector General's office had its evidence. 17 words. 72 days. And she'd followed worse operational parameters in villages where the streets were packed earth and the buildings had no roofs anymore. Her stethoscope hung around her neck, light green, standard issue, nothing distinguishing. In her locker, wedged behind the extra scrubs, sat a tarnished military challenge coin wrapped carefully in a photograph she couldn't afford to look at during shift hours. The secure tablet was heavier. Danielle checked its position in her bag, beneath the extra pen lights, above the trauma shears, positioned at an angle where it wouldn't register on the metal detector that hospital security occasionally ran at random intervals. The tablet contained 48 documented billing irregularities, phantom consultations, procedure codes for work never performed, insurance claims stamped by phantom supervisors whose employee IDs didn't exist in Cedar Creek Medical's HR system. Dr. Marcus Whitfield had been constructing this infrastructure for 6 months, and the Inspector General's office had been constructing the case against him for 4 of those 6 months, and Danielle had been constructing her nursing persona for 8 weeks before that. She moved to the nurse's station, a semicircular desk facing the floor-to-ceiling windows of the cardiac unit, and began reviewing the morning's admissions log. Her movements were efficient but not remarkable. She was the kind of nurse hospital administrators didn't notice at budget meetings. The kind of nurse residents felt comfortable dismissing. The kind of nurse who was good at her job in ways that people attributed to diligence rather than training that included combat medicine, wilderness survival, hand-to-hand combat, and the psychological protocols of military intelligence operations. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her head. She'd learned not to flinch at sounds anymore. Danielle. It wasn't a greeting. Dr. Whitfield's voice carried across the unit from the doorway, and she recognized the acoustic signature immediately, the kind of confidence that came from never experiencing professional consequences, the timbre of a man whose family had money and connections that moved in circles Danielle had spent her career infiltrating. These billing charts aren't going to review themselves. She didn't look up. That was part of the role. Submissive posture. Deferred eye contact. The careful choreography of invisibility. "I'm finishing the morning vitals, Dr. Whitfield," she said. Her voice was softer than it used to be. She'd practiced that. "I'll have them to you by 07:30. Whitfield entered the unit with 2 pharmaceutical representatives trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. One of them carried a leather portfolio embossed with a logo from a cardiac device company. The other held a tablet displaying some kind of contract or product specification. They moved through the unit with the confidence of men who understood that hospital corridors bent toward their interests, that administrators returned their calls, that billing questions got routed to people who owed them favors. Whitfield was tall, the kind of height that came with inherited privilege and childhood tennis lessons, and his hands were soft in the way that hospital documentation described as refined. Danielle noticed these things. She'd been trained to notice things. The scar on his left ring finger suggested a prior marriage. The Rolex on his wrist was 3 years old, suggesting wealth but not ostentation. The way he moved suggested chronic lower back pain and a physician who refused to submit to physical therapy. He gestured toward her chart review. Patient in bed 6. The insurance is VA. I assume you're aware that VA insurance doesn't cover the kind of intensive cardiac work this patient actually requires. It was a test. Danielle could hear it in the cadence. She kept her eyes on the chart. I'm familiar with VA coverage limitations, Dr. Whitfield. Good. Because we're going to have a problem. The ER just radioed ahead. They're sending up a blind Army Ranger with acute cardiac distress. Admits that he's on VA insurance only. Full VA, nothing private. Nothing that would cover anything beyond basic stabilization. Danielle's hands went very still. She didn't look up. The photograph in her locker suddenly felt like it was radiating heat through the hospital walls, burning through lockers and reaching her ribs, the challenge coin pressed against her sternum like a heartbeat made of metal and memory. Is he stable for transfer? She asked. Standard protocol question. Unremarkable response. That's not the point, Whitfield said. He was moving through the unit now, gesturing at the pharmaceutical representatives as if the cardiac patients behind the glass partitions were stage props for his performance. The point is that Cedar Creek Medical doesn't run a charity operation. We have shareholders. We have credentialing requirements. I've already called cardiology. I've called electrophysiology. I've called interventional radiology. 10 specialists. 10 attendings. And every single one of them is going to tell the ER that our facility isn't equipped for this particular patient's needs. Danielle wrote a note in the chart. Her handwriting was steady. The trembling, that was the part she'd mastered first, when she was learning how to hide. The trembling was information. The trembling was data. And she learned to translate data into stillness. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Whitfield continued. He was closer now. She could smell his cologne, expensive, subtle, applied with the precision of a man who understood that olfactory markers conveyed status. This patient will not receive care at Cedar Creek Medical. Not because we're not capable, but because VA insurance doesn't cover what we're capable of providing. Do you follow? She looked up. Her eyes met his for exactly 1 second, long enough to demonstrate compliance, short enough to avoid appearing confrontational. Yes, Dr. Whitfield. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never experienced a conversation that didn't resolve in his favor. Excellent. Then, the ER call came through the overhead speaker at that moment, cutting through the ambient noise of the cardiac unit like a scalpel. Incoming trauma. Blind male, Army Ranger, acute chest pain, respiratory distress, ETA 15 minutes. Presumed acute cardiac event. VA insurance only. The voice was clinical, efficient, the kind of voice that delivered information without attachment. Whitfield's smile didn't change. He excused himself from the pharmaceutical representatives and moved to the phone at the nurse's station, his movements carrying the fluid precision of a man executing a pre-planned strategy. She watched him dial, internal extension, not an outside line, and she knew what he was doing because she'd documented it 17 times already in the secure tablet. He was calling the cardiologists. He was calling the specialists. He was calling the attendings and the mid-level providers and the consultants, and he was telling them that a VA patient was incoming, and Cedar Creek Medical's equipment wasn't suitable, and their patient load was too heavy, and other facilities might be more appropriate. 10 phone calls. That's what the documentation showed. 10 refusals. 10 physicians who were competent, qualified, and perfectly capable of providing care, all of whom suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts and equipment limitations and patient load concerns the moment they learned that the insurance was VA only. The trembling was information. Danielle translated it into stillness. She finished the chart and returned it to the rack, her movements economical. Then she gathered the morning vital sign sheet and moved toward the break room, the small kitchenette where nurses went to pretend they weren't slowly burning through their cortisol reserves, where the coffee tasted like hot water that had once shaken hands with actual coffee beans, where the fluorescent lights were slightly less intense and created the illusion of privacy. But Whitfield cut her off in the corridor. He was moving faster now, his expression unchanged, his confidence intact. And when she looked up, that's when the tray in her hands became peripheral to the conversation. He reached out, hand opening, and struck the tray with the casual precision of someone swatting a mosquito. The crash was remarkably quiet. The coffee cup shattered against the tile, one sharp report followed by the softer sound of ceramic pieces settling into their final positions. The salad scattered, lettuce and dressing spreading across the floor in an almost artistic pattern. The sandwich broke into 2 pieces. The water bottle rolled toward the corner. Nobody moved. The corridor had 3 other people in it, 2 nurses and an orderly, and all 3 of them suddenly became very interested in charts, doorways, and the middle distance. Whitfield picked up a patient chart from the nearby desk. It belonged to bed 9, was completely unrelated to the conversation, was chosen purely for symbolic effect, and dropped it at her feet. The file was heavy. It made a sound like a small animal falling. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. His voice was pleasant, conversational, the kind of voice you'd use to ask someone the time. Or is bending over beneath a nurse's dignity. Danielle stood very still. The broken tray was at her feet. The scattered salad was at her feet. The patient chart was at her feet. And Whitfield was watching her with the expression of a man who was testing something, not her physical capacity, but her threshold for humiliation, her breaking point, her willingness to maintain the facade that had brought her to Cedar Creek Medical in the first place. She crouched down. Her movements were slow, controlled, the movements of someone who had learned that speed could suggest anger and anger could compromise operations. She gathered the broken ceramic. She collected the scattered food. She organized the papers from the fallen chart. Her hands didn't shake. The trembling was information, and she'd learned to store information internally, in spaces where only her nervous system could access it. The orderly looked away. The 2 nurses suddenly became very engaged with their documentation. "Thank you," Whitfield said. He walked past her without waiting for a response, and his footsteps echoed down the corridor with the satisfied cadence of a man who had successfully administered a test and received the answer he required. Danielle remained crouched, gathering the final pieces of the salad, the broken coffee cup, the scattered components of her morning meal. The chart was intact. She straightened it, reorganized its pages, returned it to the proper place. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her expression was what she'd trained it to be: professional, composed, unmarked by anything that might suggest she'd experienced humiliation rather than merely witnessed it. She stood up, the remains of her breakfast contained in a small pile in her hands, and she walked to the trash. She disposed of the debris with the same efficiency she would have employed if the items had never belonged to her, had never touched her hands, had never been scattered across hospital tile by a man whose confidence was constructed from institutional privilege and the reasonable assumption that nobody in the room had the capacity to make him understand what he'd actually done. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the part that would eventually matter. What mattered happened 40 minutes later, alone in the supply closet, where she'd gone to retrieve additional supplies for the incoming patient and instead found herself pressing her forehead against cold metal shelving, eyes closed, hands gripping the steel edge until her knuckles went white. 3 seconds. That's all she allowed herself. The mission parameters were explicit on this point: 3 seconds of processing, then reintegration into cover. She thought about her son. She thought about Baghdad. She thought about a command voice that had sounded like gravel and authority, telling her unit that casualties were unacceptable and performance was non-negotiable. She thought about that same voice calling her name across a hospital floor while his eyes had told her something that his words weren't permitted to acknowledge. The challenge coin in her locker seemed to pulse against the walls of the building, burning through lockers and reaching toward her, a reminder that some people didn't get second chances, that some people got one deployment and then came home in a flag-folded box, and that some people got to spend their entire careers wondering if they'd taught the right techniques, emphasized the right protocols, given the right order. 3 seconds. Danielle opened her eyes, straightened her spine, and returned to the cardiac unit. The incoming patient would arrive in 4 minutes. 10 doctors had already refused care. The system was performing as designed. And somewhere in the infrastructure of Cedar Creek Medical, a blind Army Ranger was about to discover what it meant to ask for help in a hospital where help was contingent upon insurance codes and billing jurisdictions. But Danielle had been trained for this. She had learned to wait. She had learned to document. She had learned to carry secrets in the same way soldiers carried ammunition, not as a burden, but as preparation. And Thomas Keller was coming. Thomas Keller arrived at Cedar Creek Medical through the emergency department at 14:53 on a Tuesday, guided by a volunteer with a hand at his elbow, his dark glasses reflecting nothing. The white cane tapped against the tile floor, tap, 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 the metronome of precision that made several nurses glance up. Blind. 73 years old. According to the triage nurse, his ejection fraction was 30% and dropping. According to his VA insurance card, his case was about to become a problem that doctors had already decided not to solve. Danielle was updating a discharge note when she heard Dr. Chen's voice from the adjacent exam room, measured and rehearsed, like he'd given this speech before. VA reimbursement won't cover the cath lab time for a diagnostic workup at this acuity level. We'd be looking at a specialist consult that your insurance simply won't authorize. Danielle didn't need to see Keller's face to know what was happening. She'd watched it occur in the intake department for 6 months, the invisible sorting system that separated insured patients from ones whose insurance made the paperwork too expensive to justify. She continued typing, but her fingers slowed. Tap, tap, tap. The cane in the hallway. Then Dr. Patel's voice, clipped and efficient. He needs a specialist we don't have on staff. Tri-County General. Their cardiac program is excellent for VA cases. 90 seconds. Patel had spent 90 seconds examining a patient whose heart was failing, and then delegated him to another hospital in 8 words. By hour 2, the refusals had begun to stack like cards in a collapsing hand. Dr. Morrison, one of Whitfield's chosen residents, didn't even enter the room. My schedule's full. Tri-County. Dr. Vasquez checked the chart from the doorway, her expression settling into that particular blend of pity and professional distance. His condition requires interventional cardiology. We're not equipped for that level of care. Another refusal. Another doctor crossing the room as if Keller's chest pain and failing ventricles were someone else's emergency. The cafeteria buzzed with the smell of institutional food, something like beef and something like regret, when Danielle entered at 17:30, her stomach hollow from not eating since 6 o'clock. She carried a tray past the attending physician's table, past Whitfield's regular seat where he sat reviewing something on his phone, when his elbow rose with the precision of someone who'd practiced the motion in his mind 1,000 times. The tray twisted. Soup scattered across her scrubs in a hot arc. A ceramic bowl shattered against the tile floor with the sound of something breaking that couldn't be fixed. The cafeteria went dead silent. The hum of fluorescent lights became audible, a sound like electricity given voice. Whitfield smiled down at her from his chair, his teeth showing in that particular way that announced his power to everyone watching. He picked up a patient chart from his table, Keller's chart, she realized, and dropped it at her feet. Pick that up, sweetheart. Or is bending over beneath a nurse's dignity. His voice was easy, conversational, like he'd just asked her the time of day instead of asking her to kneel in public. 2 residents laughed. 1 actually laughed. The sound hung in the air like a physical thing. Danielle's hands didn't shake. Her face showed nothing, no flush, no tremor, no visible reaction. She crouched slowly, gathering the scattered papers, her movements deliberate and controlled, the way someone moves through water. Around the cafeteria, 40 people found their phones suddenly fascinating. 1 in turn started to rise, his chair scraping back, but his attending grabbed his arm and pulled him down without a word. The message was clear, that person on the floor was someone you didn't help. That person was beneath the conversation. She gathered the last page, stood, and placed the chart on the table beside Whitfield's coffee cup. She didn't speak. She didn't meet his eyes. She left the cafeteria with soup soaking through her scrubs like failure. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how easily everyone looked away. The supply closet at 1945 was where she allowed herself the mercy of 3 seconds. Her forehead pressed against cold metal shelving, the kind hospitals stock everywhere, never thinking about who might use it as a place to come apart. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds and thought of her son's voice on the phone, 6 years ago, describing how Commander Keller had picked him up during a firefight in Baghdad, how Keller had carried him through fire while rounds snapped past their ears like angry insects. How her son had lived because Keller was the kind of soldier who didn't leave people behind. Danielle opened her eyes. The 3 seconds were finished. She straightened her scrubs, wiped her face on the back of her wrist, and walked back into Cedar Creek Medical as if the universe hadn't just tried to crush her. By 2030, the refusals had reached a critical mass. Dr. Hayes had examined Keller's EKG and mentioned limitation of care discussions. Dr. Bennett had suggested comfort measures instead of intervention. Dr. Conrad had recommended hospice. 10 doctors. In less than 6 hours, 10 different physicians had found 10 different ways to say they wouldn't help him. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who'd been trained to see it, and Danielle had been trained to see everything. She reviewed the medical records at the nurse's station, her fingers moving across the tablet screen, photographing the billing codes attached to each refusal encounter. They were coding consultations as completed procedures. Consultations that never happened. Consultations that Whitfield was billing to Medicare as if they'd occurred, as if 10 different doctors had spent time with Keller instead of spending 15 seconds explaining why they couldn't. The scheme wasn't subtle once you understood the structure. It was almost elegant: keep the patients with bad insurance, refuse them care, bill Medicare for the refusals anyway, move the difficult cases elsewhere before anyone noticed the contradiction. At 9 p.m., Danielle entered Keller's room. The lights were off. He sat in complete darkness, the way someone sits when they've learned to live without sight, his scarred hands resting on the bed rail. His hands had lines that cut deep, the texture of someone who'd held a rifle for 40 years, who'd pulled people out of burning vehicles, who'd carried her son through fire. "You don't have to do this," Keller said quietly, his blind eyes directed precisely toward her voice. "VL send me to another facility eventually." There was no bitterness in his tone, only the flatness of someone stating facts he'd already accepted. Danielle stepped closer. The darkness didn't matter to him, but it mattered to her. It made what came next easier. "Your ejection fraction is 30% and dropping. Eventually isn't soon enough." She kept her voice professional, the practiced tone of a nurse discussing clinical facts. But she was already signing herself onto his case, already deciding to violate hospital protocol by accepting primary responsibility for a patient no attending physician would claim. Keller reached into his jacket with the careful precision of someone navigating by touch. His fingers emerged holding something small and tarnished, a military challenge coin the color of old copper. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers reading the inscription the way sighted people read with their eyes. "Your son carried this in Baghdad," Keller said. "Found it in his gear after." He stopped, extended the coin toward her voice. "Thought his family should have it." Danielle's hand trembled once as she took it. Just once. The tremor was brief, barely perceptible, but it was there, the mask slipping for a single second. She could feel the dent on the edge from the photograph in her locker, the one she'd memorized. She recognized every flaw on this object the way you recognize the voice of someone you love. "I was his commanding officer," Keller said quietly. "Best soldier under my command. Smartest too. He would have made Master Chief in 10 years. Would have." He stopped. In the darkness, Danielle understood exactly what he meant to say. Her son would have made Master Chief. Would have. Past tense. The words lived in that silence. She didn't speak. She placed the coin in her pocket and made a decision that would change everything. At 21:45, Whitfield appeared in the doorway like a prediction that had come true. His smile was predatory, the expression of someone who'd already calculated all possible outcomes and found them favorable. "Ross, I'm assigning Keller to Dr. Morrison for a central line placement in the morning. Morrison's available. You're off his case." The statement landed like an order, clinical and absolute. Danielle kept her voice neutral, professional, the tone of someone who was merely confirming logistics. "Morrison refused him 8 hours ago." She said it as a fact, neither a question nor a challenge. "Just information." Whitfield's expression hardened incrementally. "Morrison is now available. You're not qualified for cardiac cases above level 2. Consider this an educational opportunity to learn your limitations." He turned to leave before she could respond, already moving on to the next calculation, the next step in his orchestrated refusal. He didn't understand that he'd just confirmed everything she needed to confirm. After he left, Danielle reviewed Morrison's file. 6 months out of medical school. Barely certified. And the central line was coded as a level 4 billable procedure, the kind of intervention that generated the kind of revenue that made refusals financially attractive. She photographed 3 pages of billing records on her secure tablet, her hand steady now, the tremor gone, replaced by something colder and more dangerous. The encrypted message from the Inspector General's office arrived at 23:17, maintain cover. 6 more weeks needed for federal case. No direct intervention. She read it and deleted it and understood exactly what that meant. No direct intervention. No calling in favors. No telling Keller who she was, why she understood what was happening to him, what her son's voice had sounded like when it talked about Commander Keller carrying him through fire. Danielle sat in the darkened nurse's station with the challenge coin in her hand, feeling its weight, its history, the dent that marked the moment her son had stopped coming home. She had been trained to follow orders. She had been trained to wait, to observe, to let investigations develop at their own pace. But some orders, she was learning, were meant to be broken by people like her, people with nothing left to lose except the ability to help. The alert came at 0430 hours, a vibration against Danielle's thigh that made her sit up in the call room before the phone screen even glowed. Not the standard bed request. The priority sequence. Keller's room. Her legs were moving before her eyes focused on the message, distended neck veins, respiratory distress, blood pressure dropping. She didn't run. Running drew attention. She walked, fast but controlled, down the corridor toward the cardiac unit, her badge already in her hand, the tarnished challenge coin still pressed against her ribs in her scrub pocket where Keller had slipped it that morning, a weight that felt like proof of something. The moment she pushed through the double doors, the room contracted around a single fact: the monitors were screaming. Keller lay against the pillows, his dark glasses askew, his neck veins distended like rope under his skin, the kind of distension that meant pressure was building somewhere that should have been empty. His breathing came in shallow, rapid pulls. The central line Whitfield's resident had placed yesterday was still in place, the site now bleeding slightly, the catheter tip positioned too deep, too far into the right atrium. Danielle's mind catalogued the details with the precision of someone who had spent 17 years reading the language blood pressure and oxygen saturation spoke. Dr. Morrison, the resident who had placed the line, stood frozen at the foot of the bed, his hands visibly trembling, his jaw working silently. Blood pressure. Danielle's voice was already in motion, already commanding, the voice that had called 9 other rangers through a firefight in Sanjin Valley 3,000 miles and half a lifetime away. 70/40. It was 90 a few minutes ago. It's dropping. Morrison's words came out like broken glass. I followed the protocol. Dr. Whitfield said it was routine. He said the deep placement was necessary for. Danielle was already reaching for the crash cart, her hands moving with the muscle memory that lived deeper than thought. She assessed Keller's chest first, listening with the stethoscope, hearing what she expected to hear, heart sounds distant, muffled, as if someone had wrapped them in gauze. The sound was like hearing a voice through thick glass. Tamponade. Blood filling the sac around his heart, compressing it, choking it, killing him in increments measured in seconds. He has 90 seconds, Danielle said, and hit the code button. The alarm wailed through the unit, but she already knew the response time was for minutes minimum from the ER. Keller had 90 seconds. The calculation was brutally simple. She opened the crash cart and pulled the pericardiocentesis kit, her fingers finding each instrument exactly where it should be, the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the sterile field, the sterile gloves that snapped against her wrists like gunshots in the terrible quiet of the room. Morrison backed toward the door, his face the color of old concrete. "I'll get Dr. Whitfield. He'll know what to do." He said to call him if anything unusual. "There's no time." Danielle was already prepping the insertion site at the left sternal border, the area between the 5th and 6th ribs where the needle would enter the pericardial sac. Her movements were economical, precise, the movements of someone who had done this in a Humvee with mortars falling outside the windows, in a forward operating base where the electricity cut out every 12 minutes and the only light was a flashlight held between someone's teeth. This was cleaner. This was brighter. This was almost easy. "Morrison, I need you to keep your mouth shut about what you're about to see." "You can't, that's outside nursing scope." "You'll lose your license." "The hospital will." "Then I lose it." Danielle advanced the needle at a 45-degree angle, watching the monitor, feeling for the subtle give of the needle penetrating the pericardium. The angle was critical. Too shallow and she missed the sac. Too deep and she perforated the heart itself. She had done this 8 times in combat, and now she did it again, muscle memory and precision fused into a single motion that took 3 seconds and changed everything. The needle entered the fluid. Dark blood filled the syringe immediately, 50 milliliters, then 100, then 150. The blood that should never have been there. The blood that was killing him. On the monitor, Keller's blood pressure began its climb. 90 over 50. 100 over 60. His breathing deepened. The color came back into his face like someone slowly turning up a light behind his skin. The entire procedure took 90 seconds. She was drawing the final cc of blood from the pericardial sac when Whitfield walked through the door. His eyes moved from the monitor to the needle in Danielle's hand to the syringe now holding nearly 200 milliliters of dark blood, and she watched his face cycle through emotions like a rigged machine, confusion first, then recognition, then cold calculation spreading across his features like oil on water. He didn't ask what was happening. He already knew. And he already understood what her having done it meant. He pulled out his phone before Danielle even withdrew the needle. His voice, when he spoke, was perfectly composed, which made it somehow worse than anger would have been. "Get me the chief medical officer," he said, his eyes never leaving Danielle's hands. "We have a nurse practicing medicine without supervision. Unauthorized invasive procedure. I have a resident witness." He paused, then added, "Yes, I'm documenting the timeline now. Yes, I'll file the complaint before the end of business." Another pause. He smiled. A smile like a wolf showing its teeth. No, she was not acting under any physician's direction. She acted entirely alone. "Yes, I understand the state licensing implications." "Yes, I understand." Danielle set down the syringe on the sterile field. She removed her gloves. She said nothing. Her hands were perfectly steady. The trembling, if it came, would be later. In her car. In the dark. But not here. Not in front of him. Not in front of Morrison, who was watching her with an expression that mixed gratitude and horror in equal measure. Whitfield made for more calls in the next 3 minutes, each one adding another strand to the net he was weaving. The board chairman. The hospital's legal counsel. A state investigator he addressed by first name, the kind of familiar address that meant favors had been exchanged before. And finally, someone he addressed as a senator, a word that hung in the air with the weight of institutional machinery behind it. Power that moved through invisible channels. Power that made promises and extracted loyalty. "I want her credentials pulled before end of business today," Whitfield said into the phone, his voice conversational, almost casual. "Yes, I understand the process." Yes, I'm prepared to testify regarding what I witnessed. No, there were no mitigating circumstances. She acted entirely outside her scope of practice. He paused, listening. Yes, thank you. I appreciate your attention to this matter. The phone went dark. He looked at Danielle, and for a moment the mask slipped just slightly, enough for her to see the fear underneath the arrogance. He had felt her move. He had felt the weight of something shifting in the room when she drew that blood from Keller's pericardial sac. He didn't know what she was, not yet, but he knew she was something other than what she appeared to be. And he was terrified. But fear made him more dangerous, not less. Fear made him faster, sharper, more willing to destroy everything rather than risk what he'd built crumbling around him. By 1100 hours, the security officers arrived like clockwork. 2 of them, broad-shouldered men in dark blazers with Cedar Creek medical badges clipped to their belts. They didn't look angry. That would have been easier. They looked tired, like this was the 3rd termination they'd processed that week. The HR representative walked between them, a woman in her 50s with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Danielle was at the nurse's station, documenting vitals from her morning rounds. Her hands didn't pause. She finished the entry, blood pressure stable, O2 saturation 98%, heart rate in normal sinus rhythm, before she looked up. The room had gone quiet. Other nurses pretended not to watch, but the silence was the kind that only happens when everyone is listening. Danielle Ross. The HR woman consulted her clipboard as if she didn't already know the answer. That's me. I'm Jennifer Cross, Director of Human Resources. This is Officer Martinez and Officer Chen from Hospital Security. She cleared her throat. There's been a complaint filed regarding unauthorized medical procedures and practicing outside your scope of nursing practice. We need you to come with us. The words were rehearsed, clinical, stripped of any edge that might suggest sympathy or doubt. That was how you fired someone, with procedural language so bloodless it left no room for argument. Danielle stood without hurrying. She was still wearing her stethoscope around her neck, the one her son had given her before his deployment to Baghdad. She unhooked it carefully and set it on the desk. The chief medical officer wants to speak with you, Officer Chen said. His voice was neutral, the voice of someone trying to be kind while delivering something unkind. They walked through the cardiac unit in procession. Danielle had trained 3 of the residents she passed. One of them, a young woman named Dr. Patel, whispered something, maybe an apology, maybe just a goodbye. Danielle didn't acknowledge it. Acknowledgement would have required her to stop walking, to turn around, to let the moment become something more than a transaction. Movement was better than stillness. Movement kept the composure intact. The chief medical officer's office was on the 14th floor. The elevator hummed with fluorescent light and the soft beep of the floor counter, 7, 8, 9. Dr. Robert Harrison sat behind a mahogany desk that probably cost $30,000. He looked like he'd rather be receiving root canal treatment than this conversation. Next to him stood Dr. Marcus Whitfield, his arms crossed like a man who'd already won. Behind Whitfield stood 3 board members, all of them finding sudden fascination with the windows or their own shoes. Master Chief Petty Officer Ross. Harrison didn't use her nursing credential, just her rank, or rather, the borrowed title the hospital had given her. Please sit. She Saturday. There has been an incident in the cardiac unit. He lifted a piece of paper as if reading from it, though he clearly had memorized the words already. You performed a pericardiocentesis on patient Thomas Keller without physician authorization. You accessed controlled medications. You took clinical action that exceeds your scope of practice as a registered nurse. He paused, letting each violation settle. This hospital takes patient safety very seriously. Therefore, effective immediately, you are suspended pending investigation into these charges. Your nursing license is flagged with the state board. Your credential access is being revoked. Danielle listened to each sentence the way a sniper listens to wind, information, data, nothing personal. Her badge was still clipped to her scrubs. She unclipped it and set it on the edge of Harrison's desk. The plastic made a small sound against the wood. Then she unhooked her access card and placed it beside the badge. Whitfield smiled. That was the moment that cost him. That small, satisfied smile that said he'd done exactly what he'd intended to do. He'd broken her or broken her cover or broken the mission, and all three were victories stacked on top of each other. Danielle's eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for her expression to shift from composure to something else entirely, the look of someone who had already catalogued every weakness, every favor he owed, every hour he'd spent regretting that smile. Then she looked away. "You'll need to surrender your hospital ID immediately," one of the board members said, the words tumbling out like a child trying to fill silence. "And your employee parking pass." Danielle extracted both from her scrub's pocket and placed them beside the other items. The parking pass had an expiration date in November. She'd never see November in this building. "This is a difficult situation," Harrison said, and the pity in his voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. "We'll process your final paycheck within 7 business days. Your security deposit will be applied per your employment agreement. There's an outplacement service available to all terminated employees. I'll have someone email you the contact information." She didn't ask about the investigation. Didn't ask how long the suspension would last. Didn't defend herself or explain that Keller's heart had been dying and she'd done what the 12 years of special operations training had embedded into her nervous system. She'd saved a life. That was the mission, always. Save the life. Everything else was secondary. "You can go," Harrison said. Officer Martinez gestured toward the door, but it was a gesture, not a command. The composure had worked. She didn't look like someone who'd just watched her entire cover operation collapse. She didn't look like someone who'd spent 6 months building a case that was now worthless. She looked like a nurse who'd broken hospital policy and was accepting the consequences. Which meant nobody would look deeper. Which meant, briefly, there was still a chance to salvage something. The walk to the exit moved through the cardiac unit one more time. The cafeteria staff who'd watched Whitfield knock her tray down a day ago now watched her being escorted out by security. The message was clear: humiliation was the cost of stepping out of line. Danielle kept her face forward, her pace steady, her hands at her sides. The tremor that wanted to start in her shoulders stayed buried. The tightness in her jaw remained locked. The words that wanted to crack her composure stayed unspoken. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Keller's room. She stopped in his doorway for exactly 5 seconds. He was sleeping, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, the cardiac monitor tracing a perfect string of green peaks across the screen. The central line that Whitfield's resident had placed, the one that had nearly killed him, was still there, but she'd made sure it was correctly positioned. His oxygen saturation was 99%. His blood pressure was holding at 122/70. He was going to live. She'd done that. Officer Chen shifted uncomfortably. "We need to go." She didn't respond. She committed the scene to memory, the way the morning light fell across Keller's face, the soft beep of the monitor, the smell of antiseptic and the faint metallic trace of blood from the morning labs. This was what she'd been training for her entire military career, the moment when saving a life cost you everything else. Her son had understood that. Keller had understood that. The army understood it. Danielle understood it. She turned away from the room. The parking garage was half full, the kind of cold concrete space that echoed every footstep and smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete. Her car was a 2015 Honda Accord, unremarkable, designed not to be remembered. Officer Martinez watched her get in, then both security officers remained by the exit for another 10 seconds before returning to the building. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time without touching the ignition. Her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number, the kind that made her hands instinctively check that the car doors were locked, cover compromised. Investigation terminated. 6-month surveillance lost. Report for debrief 1400 Monday. The Inspector General's office. Which meant they'd confirmed what she already knew. The mission was over. The 6 months of documenting fraudulent billing, the coded conversations with her handler, the careful observations about Whitfield's network of allies, all of it was dust now. Her badge was gone. Her access was revoked. She was no longer embedded. She was just a nurse who'd broken protocol to save a patient. Another text arrived, this one on her encrypted phone, the one nobody at the hospital knew about. Whitfield activated contacts at state and federal level. Someone in the governor's office, someone at the State Board of Nursing, someone high enough that the investigation got shut down from above. He has a senator in his pocket. This came from internal channels. Be careful. The challenge coin was still in her scrub's pocket. Keller had pressed it into her palm that morning before everything collapsed, before the pericardiocentesis, before Whitfield had witnessed those final seconds and made his phone calls. The coin was tarnished silver, worn smooth from years of handling. On one side was the motto her son had carried into his last firefight, so others may live. On the other side was the date of her final tour in Baghdad, the one where she'd trained Keller's unit, the one where she'd taught medics how to save lives under fire. The one where her son had died saving 3 Rangers, using every technique she'd taught him. She turned the coin over and over in her palm, watching the light catch the worn edges. 23 years. 23 years of service, of training, of never failing a mission that mattered. Every deployment she'd completed. Every rescue she'd executed. Every person she'd saved. And now this, sitting alone in a parking garage with her access revoked and her cover blown and a challenge coin warming to her skin temperature as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects dying in a lantern. She reached for the ignition 3 times. The first time, her hand stopped halfway. The second time, she didn't even lift her hand off the steering wheel. The third time, she turned on the engine and then turned it off again after 2 seconds. The parking garage camera recorded her sitting motionless, visible only as a silhouette through the windshield, as 40 minutes passed. Then 50. Then an hour. The concrete walls pressed in with the weight of failure. Not the failure of saving Keller, that had succeeded. The failure of the mission, the failure of 6 months of work, the failure to finish what she'd started. Her phone showed 12:47. 13 minutes until lunch service in the hospital cafeteria. 22 minutes until Whitfield would be walking those halls as if he'd won something. 6 hours until her handler expected her at a debrief where she'd have to explain why an embedded federal investigation had collapsed in a single morning. But that wasn't what kept her from turning the key. What kept her was the understanding that the moment she drove out of this parking garage, she would be back to being nobody. Just a nurse who'd broken protocol. Just a woman who'd failed to bring down a corrupt doctor. Just another person who tried to do the right thing and paid for it with everything she had. The challenge coin sat in her palm like a stone. So others may live. Her son had lived that motto for 23 days of his deployment. He died teaching it to Rangers who'd made it home. Keller had made it home. The 3 Rangers her son had saved had made it home. That was the mission accomplished. That was the victory nobody would ever know about because she couldn't explain it without compromising the investigation. An investigation that was already compromised. An investigation that was already dead. She closed her eyes and sat very still in the fluorescent-lit darkness of the parking garage, holding a coin that meant everything and nothing at all. The television mounted above the Cedar Creek medical lobby erupted with a face Danielle's colleagues had never seen before. Military portrait. Dress blues. Service medals arranged in perfect rows. The Chiron scrolled beneath it like an accusation, decorated combat medic missing after undercover investigation. Staff members froze mid-stride. A resident dropped her coffee cup. The sound of ceramic shattering against tile seemed to shake the entire atrium. Heads turned. Mouths opened. Nobody moved toward the television. Nobody looked away. Commander Thomas Keller stood from his wheelchair in the doorway. He hadn't moved in 6 hours. The doctors had made certain of that, rolling past his room like he was furniture. Now his dark glasses caught the fluorescent light as he turned toward the television screen, toward his former nurses, toward the image of a woman they had all just watched being escorted out by security that morning. His voice was soft, almost conversational. Seahawk. 3 syllables. That was all. The operational code name. The only call sign used in classified briefings. The one Danielle herself had chosen in 2003 when she completed her first embedded assignment with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Only 3 people had known it. Keller, her son, her commanding officer at JSOC Task Force 121, who had been dead for 4 years. The lobby held its breath. The veteran security guard who had escorted Danielle from the building that morning stepped forward from the perimeter wall where he'd been standing for hours, watching the television. His name was Mitchell. 15-year former Marine. He'd escorted her because he'd been ordered to. He'd felt ashamed doing it. His voice broke like old wood splintering. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Navy Cross recipient. 3 tours as a Special Operations medic embedded with Army Rangers. He paused. The words hung in the silence like weight suspended on cables. She was your nurse. This morning. The chief medical officer's face had gone the color of institutional paint. Someone's pager beeped. Nobody answered it. The sliding doors opened without anyone triggering the sensor. 2 military police officers in dress uniforms entered first. Then a 2-star general in his service dress with ribbon spanning his chest like a battle map. General Holloway. He carried a manila folder that looked impossibly thick. The room compressed around him the way air pressure changes before a storm. He approached the television screen and did not look at the gathered staff. He looked only at the portrait of Danielle Ross. Master Chief Ross served 12 years in the Naval Special Warfare Command. From 2003 to 2015. He opened the folder. His voice was the kind that didn't require volume, it commanded space by existing in it. 17 confirmed combat saves. Multiple classified assignments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen. Personal decorations including the Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy Cross for Valor under fire in Helmand Province, 2011. He paused. Looked up at the assembled medical staff. She abandoned a federal investigation into systematic healthcare fraud to save the life of a man her son died protecting. Keller removed his dark glasses. The scarring around his eyes was visible now, deep radiating lines that looked like cracks in desert clay. His eyes themselves were damaged, yes, but they could perceive light and shadow, shapes and movement. Enough. He turned toward the gathered crowd and the news cameras that had somehow already arrived, already positioned, already rolling. Master Chief Ross trained every medic in my unit, including her own son, Private First Class Marcus Ross Jr. When our convoy hit an IED outside Sanjin Valley in Helmand Province, Marcus was the only medic conscious. He used her techniques, her protocols, the exact sequences she taught him in a secure briefing room at Forward Operating Base Shank. Keller's voice did not shake. It was steady like gunfire. He saved 3 Rangers that day. He died saving those 3 Rangers. Using techniques his mother taught him. Techniques she's been using to save lives ever since. The silence stretched. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric hum. Someone in the back of the crowd was crying, a young resident, maybe, or a medical student, or someone who had watched Danielle pick up scattered papers from the cafeteria floor without flinching, without complaint, without ever revealing what she actually was. Dr. Raymond Chen's face appeared on the conference room screen. Nobody had called him. The television had called him. The viral video had called him. The 28 million view cafeteria footage of Dr. Whitfield throwing charts at a nurse had reached Chicago at approximately 1,147 hours, and Raymond Chen had watched it and had made his own calls. My name is Dr. Raymond Chen. I sponsored Marcus Whitfield's medical school admission. I wrote his fellowship recommendation. I guided his early career. The image on the screen was motionless, Chen sitting in an office, backlit by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. I have just withdrawn my endorsement. I have requested the medical board review every case he supervised. I am formally disassociating myself from him and from any institution that employs him. The screen went dark. The doors at the far end of the lobby opened. The state licensing investigator whom Whitfield had called that morning, the one he believed was his ally, walked through with 2 federal agents flanking him. They moved like they owned the space. Like they had already measured every exit and calculated every angle. The chief medical officer's lawyer appeared beside him. Too late. Always too late. The prosecutor's voice came from somewhere, from a phone, from an overhead speaker, from the weight of accumulated documentation, reading Miranda rights with the precision of a surgical procedure. Warrant servers moved through the hospital like they were on a timeline. Whitfield's office. His files. His personal computer. His communications with a United States senator under investigation for Medicare fraud conspiracy worth $847,000 in fraudulent billing codes approved and signed and forwarded to insurance companies with Whitfield's clinical signature. The cafeteria video had 2 million views by noon. By 1300 hours, it had 4 million. By 1500 hours, it was embedded in a New York Times article about systemic disrespect toward nurses in American healthcare. The comment section filled with testimonies. Nurses describing similar humiliations. Veterans describing similar refusals of care. Medical ethicists describing similar patterns of institutional retaliation against whistleblowers. Dr. Whitfield sat alone in his office, former office, as security waited to escort him from the building. His hands were shaking in a way Danielle's never had. His face had gone the color of old ash. His phone lit up with notification after notification. Professional organizations revoking memberships. Colleagues unfriending him from social media. Medical journals announcing emergency reviews of his published research. One by one, his speaking engagements were cancelled. His consulting contracts were terminated. His wife's lawyer filed divorce papers, citing irreconcilable differences and conduct unbecoming. He didn't resist when security escorted him out. There was nothing to resist anymore. By 1700 hours, his hospital credentials were revoked. By 1900 hours, the state medical board had suspended his license pending investigation. By 2100 hours, 3 major journals had retracted 8 of his published research articles after discovering falsified patient data and manipulated outcomes. The viral video continued climbing. 28 million views by the end of the week. Embedded in ethics courses. Discussed in medical school classrooms. Used as a case study in healthcare administration. The unnamed nurse who had shown perfect composure while being humiliated. The decorated combat veteran who had been refused care by 10 different doctors because a fraud scheme beneficiary wanted to avoid scrutiny. The commander who had stood from his wheelchair and spoken a single code name that changed everything. 6 months later, Danielle stood in the rebuilt Inspector General's office in Atlanta, her Master Chief insignia now visible on her federal credentials. Senior Healthcare Fraud Investigator. The Whitfield investigation had spawned 14 additional cases across 4 states. $37 million in fraudulent billing recovered. VA contractor oversight reformed. New protocols implemented. Whistleblower protection mechanisms strengthened. On her desk sat the tarnished challenge coin, the one her son had carried into his final firefight, the one Keller had pressed into her palm that morning, now mounted in a shadow box beside her Navy Cross and a photograph of Private First Class Marcus Ross Jr. in his Ranger tan beret. A text message arrived from Keller. Training session went well. Taught 30 nurses how to spot billing fraud patterns. They asked about you. She allowed herself a small smile. The kind of smile that came from knowing the mission had actually mattered. That knowing the real cost, you'd do it again. The wall monitor showed a community college classroom in a strip mall outside Jacksonville. Dr. Marcus Whitfield in a polo shirt with the school's logo stood before a group of bored students demonstrating CPR compressions to a rubber torso. His wage, $16 per hour. His medical license, permanently revoked across all 50 states. His legacy, a cautionary case study in medical ethics, in the cost of disrespect, in what happens when you underestimate the quiet ones. Danielle picked up her briefcase. The challenge coin caught the light one final moment before she closed the lid. Through her window, she could see Cedar Creek Medical, now under new leadership, where a bronze plaque had been installed in the lobby honoring healthcare workers who place patient welfare above personal cost. She'd made sure her name wasn't on it. The mission didn't require recognition. It required silence. It required the next investigation. The next hospital. The next institution where fraud was hiding and patients were suffering. She closed the door to her office without looking back. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever seen someone pass judgment without knowing the truth, then you need to see this story. Subscribe now. Like this video. Comment below with your own stories of being judged and proven right. And hit that notification bell because we're releasing the full investigation series next week, and you won't want to miss what happens when institutions finally answer for what they've done.